Hey everybody, this is Mr. Matthew again for our MCAS Ecosystems video number 6. In this video, we're going to talk about the direct and indirect effects of human activities on biodiversity. So what this means is we're going to look at some of the direct effects that humans' activities have had on biodiversity, some of the indirect impacts, unintended consequences, if you will, and then also some of the remediation efforts that are being done in order to help improve or return ecosystems back to a better, more biodiverse state. All right, so here we go. So let's start with our direct effects of human activities on biodiversity and ecosystem health. And we're going to talk about a few different things to start. So let's first talk about habitat fragmentation. And so in habitat fragmentation, and we discussed this in an earlier video, what we're doing is we're taking and developing land, and as a result of developing that land, we're breaking up what was a once continuous ecosystem. And in this instance, I have over on the left a logging road that's going in, and this logging road is now breaking up the ecosystem from the left side of the road to the right side of the road. Now, if this is going to stay as a dirt road and we're looking at large organisms such as deer or bears, they'll be able to walk across that road and it won't be much of an issue. But smaller organisms may actually be losing a continuum of habitat between the left and the right. The trees that were there may have been crucial for organisms moving from one area to the other. And for smaller organisms, they also may not be able to move from one side to another because of just simply their size and the loss of the trees where they once lived. We now will not have the continuum of habitat that once existed. If this is further developed, maybe this is paved and we put in some stores and we put in some other man-made structures, we may be permanently disrupting the continuum of this ecosystem, and we may prevent gene flow from one side to the other, and this may ultimately change the biodiversity of this area because we're going to make two very small gene pools as opposed to the larger original gene pool for certain species. Another impact that we can have is the introduction of non-native species. This is an interesting one because sometimes this is done intentionally, other times it's unintentional. So here I show the zebra mussels on the upper middle, and on the bottom middle I show you purple loosestrife. Purple loosestrife was first brought to the United States as an ornamental. It wasn't planted in wetlands intentionally, and zebra mussels were also unintentionally brought over through ships' ballasts and introduced into waterways. Now both of these organisms are going in and they're out competing native species for habitat, and as a result of their actions, what we're seeing is we're seeing a loss of biodiversity in areas and a loss of habitat for many native species. The last thing that we're going to look at is the prospect of overharvesting. And in this particular case, we're looking at the fish in tons. And so we're looking at what happened to the Atlantic cod stocks in the east coast of Newfoundland. And what we find here is that in the 1960s and 1970s, we had this big boom of Atlantic cod in that region. But in 1992, we saw a decimation of this population. And it's strongly suspected that the reason for that loss is the overharvesting of Atlantic cod by humans for food. And so the big thing that we can see here is that because of our direct actions, we have reduced the biodiversity. The Atlantic cod and its interactions with other organisms in that ecosystem are now going to be dramatically altered, and it's going to have shifts in that entire Atlantic ecosystem where the cod once was a major player in the fisheries and the aquatic ecosystem. So some indirect effects that we have, and again, some of them are byproducts. So for example, pollution is often a byproduct. We are utilizing, in most instances, fossil fuel for energy, as we see these large smokestacks on the lower left. And as a byproduct of using fossil fuels for energy, we are creating this pollution as a byproduct of that. The goal here is not to be putting pollution into the air, but we're seeing this as an indirect impact. Above here, we see a pile of trash and things left behind. Again, this is not intentionally the goal. The goal was not to put waste and trash on the shoreline, but for a variety of reasons, how we dispose of our trash, how we overpackage certain materials, and generally how much waste we generate, we're seeing waste unintentionally get into certain areas. Climate change is another area where we see unintended consequences. So this here is an image of some glaciers in Denali National Park. And so what you can see is the receding glaciers from the top down to the bottom. The bottom is a more modern image. I believe there's about 70 years in between these two images. And what we see here is because of the warming climate, the shorter cold season, the longer warm season, we're seeing a great retreat in glaciers at a rate that is much faster than was originally anticipated. We also will see sea level is rising. So currently we're at a 3 millimeter per year rise on average, but in some areas we're actually seeing that places below sea level may see a greater rise. We also expect that as the ice breaks off of land masses and goes into the ocean, we're going to actually see a spike in the sea level rise. And so again, the climate change is leading to some unintended or indirect effects on ecosystems and biodiversity, because what we're seeing here is that the waste and the pollution over on the left, the loss of ice, and the rise in sea levels are all going to shape the ecosystems where there are living things currently, and that's going to create some selective pressure on what organisms will survive and what organisms won't in those given ecosystems. So what are some things that humans are doing to try to help with biodiversity and ecosystem health? Well, one of the things that you will find is there are some captive breeding programs. And so we have over here in the upper left, we see some red wolves that are being raised in captivity. We see a wild cat that is being bottle fed in the lower left. And then we see some black-footed, I believe those are prairie dogs, that are being raised in captivity to be released back out into the wild to help bolster the wild populations of those prairie dogs that we're seeing. Now, these are organisms that were once more prevalent, and hopefully by undergoing captive breeding, we might be able to bolster numbers back to pre-disturbance levels. Another thing that we're doing is habitat restoration. So unlike our image that I showed you before, where we're putting in logging roads, there are places where they are blocking out and they are saying, no, we're not going to have any development in these regions, creating conservation areas, and then actively using manpower to remove, and that's what we see on the lower right, remove organisms that may be non-native and hope to try to restore the native populations back to, again, pre-disturbance levels. So these are some things that we're trying to do. Now, all of these have some positives and some negatives. And so if you were to be given one of these, you might be asked something like, which of this is the best solution? Should we be creating broader habitats? Should we be trying to return organisms from captivity? What steps should we be doing in order to reverse some of the negative human impacts? The reason that we talk about these is none of these are perfect to return things to a pre-disruption state. So there are definitely going to be trade-offs, and you may need to do some thinking before deciding what to attempt. Now, another thing to keep in mind when we look at the activities we see with humans and the loss of biodiversity are the concept of pollution and pollution mitigation. And so we have this image from New York from the middle of the 1900s, and you can see the smog blocking out. So you see very, very little ability to see off into the distance. And then next to that, I have this graph which shows the general trend that as per capita income increases, in other words, as a country becomes more westernized, for lack of a better term, what we see is for the first portion of that development, we're going to see an increase in environmental disruption. But once we reach a turning point, some per capita level, the environmental impacts of that population start to get reversed, and we actually see a decline in the environmental impact and an improvement in the environment by more wealthy nations. And so this is a bit of a point of privilege that as a population becomes more economically stable, they're not willing to sacrifice the environment and to try to eke out every little bit of development, but rather they actually want to have clean air and clean water and that sort of thing. Now, this in itself provides us a great challenge because there are some countries where the quality of living is quite good, and there's other countries where the quality of living is not so good. So how do you help countries that are in the prospect of developing not undergo the same process of making the environment worse as they increase their per capita income. This is oftentimes a point of great contention where countries that are considered developed are trying to put pressure on developing nations not to create pollution, not to disrupt the environment, not to cut down their forests, but they're standing at a position of being haves, having great privilege and having great wealth, and they're turning to people who have not had the opportunity to develop and saying, no, don't develop. It creates a great tension between nations, and it is something that you have to evaluate and refine in your solutions, and we're struggling with. Now, two things that may help other countries develop without maybe necessarily going through the same environmental harm that we did and countries like China and Western Europe underwent is if we were to look at how we use energy and move to an energy system that is more conservation based. And so what we see here is this is a breakdown of how we use energy. You see a very small percentage is used in residential and commercial energy. The next biggest chunk that we see is in industrial usage. And then what we'll see is the second largest chunk of this wedge is in transportation. And then the largest is in electric power. So if we were able to move and constrict the amount of energy that we use, particularly from those that are environmental worsening forms of energy, such as fossil fuels, we could help reduce the environmental impact in both our nation and in developing nations. And this could have a huge impact if we were to, let's say, lower our carbon footprint by reducing the electric power we use coming from coal and natural gas and oil and convert that over to using solar and wind, carbon neutral forms of energy. Therefore, we would see a much less smog. We would see a much less impact by the pollution that is currently what we're facing from our current energy system. The last thing I have up here is the idea of ecotourism. And so ecotourism, in this case, you can see some people riding along elephants as they're visiting a rhinoceros watering hole. And so this is just a kind of cool thing to do. There's parts of the world where they have great natural resources, rainforests, rare animals, wildlife refuges. And rather than encouraging those countries to go through the same development arc that we've seen in China, in the US, in Western Europe, where they develop the land, go through that worsening of the environment, they're saying, no, conserve your land and then use that land as an ecotourism destination. People will pay high amounts of money to come and visit your area, and that will then put money into your economy. And without worsening your environment, you can have influxes of cash in order to allow people to buy food and improve their general standard of living. This has been a successful model in a few small locations around the world, and it's something that we're looking at, that as we change both our energy system and the view of ecotourism, we may be able to get to mitigating the pollution that we usually see in developing nations, and instead we could see a reduction in the use of energy and an increase in conservation, both of energy and of the organisms and habitats that live in these areas. All right, so I hope that was a helpful review. So at this point, you should be able to analyze direct and indirect effects of human activities and how those impact biodiversity and ecosystem health. Specifically, you should be aware how habitat fragmentation, introduction of non-native or invasive species, overharvesting, pollution, and climate change are all factors that will impact ecosystem health and biodiversity. Humans are working on some solutions, and so you should be able to look at a potential solution and ask some questions about it, evaluate and refine if a solution for reducing the impact of human activities on biodiversity and ecosystem health, if one is better or worse than another. And some of those types of programs you might want to be asked about, or that you may be asked about, would include captive breeding programs, habitat restoration, pollution mitigation, energy conservation, and ecotourism. All right, so I hope that was helpful, and I will talk to everybody soon.